Welcome to this week's Parsha Shiur, Parsha Shelach. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Two ideas looking forward to share with you today. The first is the power of silence, and some beautiful ideas happens to be from Telzer Rosh Yeshivas, Rav Motel Katz, and Rabbi Eliyahu Bloch. Some very beautiful ideas. The Parsha, of course, is centered around the Meraglim. The Pasuk says, "Vayidar Hashem al Moshe Leimer, Shlach lecha anoshim v'yosu es eretz Canaan asher ani nosen livnei Yisrael." The famous incident where Moshe Rabbeinu sends the Meraglim to spy out Eretz Yisrael. A few weeks ago, I read an article, in a very interesting article of a certain lady who described something called digital detox retreats. What are they? It started out she was on a train ride, a long train ride, and she had a can of Coke in her bag, and it burst or something, and it went all over her phone, and it killed her phone. And the initial fear was, I'm sure we can all empathize with this, is that one of absolute fear. I'm contactless. My whole life is in my phone. How am I going to cope now with this long journey without a phone? And the fear, she said, suddenly, eventually it turned into absolute relief. She said that the 3-hour journey was a machai. She just resigned herself to the fact that she was not contactable. And she said it was wonderful. And she then wanted to explore this a little bit more. And she came across something called digital detox retreats, where essentially you go to a cottage in the middle of the beautiful English countryside. I'm sure they have it in other countries as well. There is no Wi-Fi, there's no technology. You sort of just go there and you walk through a few fields to go to your cabin. There's nothing else there other than green and grass. There's books to read. There's nothing else to do in the cabin that you take. And it's sort of a detox to the 24/7 bombardment that sort of dazzles our brains right now. And she was extolling the virtues of the power of silence. Now, I think that concept of silence, and there is definitely merit in sort of making our crazy busy lives where we're bombarded with technology a little less crazy, but the concept of the power of silence appears in this week's Parsha. How so? Well, the first question is, why didn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu prevent the tragic episode of the Meraglim? Why didn't he say, no, you're not sending Meraglim, it's not going to have a happy ending, and just no, don't send Meraglim. Rav Motel Katz, and this I think was quoted by Rabbi Frand, he says that sometimes the most effective strategy in chinuch is actually to remain silent. And I see this quite often. Sometimes you see a Talmud, and not only in chinuch, in parenting as well, the Talmud or the child is not ready to accept no for an answer, and therefore it's just not the right time. And sometimes the best strategy is to remain silent. And says Rav Motel Katz, perhaps that's what's going on over here. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu realized that Klal Yisrael were not on the spiritual level to say, okay, we'll just go into Eretz Yisrael. They weren't ready to have that answer. They wanted to send Meraglim. And that's really sort of alluded to in the words lecha, shlach lecha. The principle is illustrated by this lecha. If you take a look at the Rashi says that shlach lecha is ledaitcha. Says Rashi, ledaitcha, ani eini metzav lecha. I'm not commanding you to do this. If you want to send messengers, agents, spies, then do so. As in Rashi goes on to say. So Rashi is essentially saying that ledaitcha, if you want to send it, send it. I'm not going to stop you, because Klal Yisrael weren't on the spiritual level to hear the refusal from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's a Gemara in Yevamos, Samach Yom Beis, which says, "Kashem shem mitzvah la'odem lo medava hanishma." Just like there's a mitzvah to say something which will be heard, kach mitzvah al-odem shelo lo medava she'ein nishma. There is also a mitzvah to not say something which won't be heard. A very important principle. Rabbi Franz goes on and tells, it's not in this week's Sedra, I think I saw this in Rabbi Rosner's Sefer, quoting Rabbi Franz elsewhere. He tells an amazing anecdote of Rav Motel Katz. Rav Motel Katz was one of the great Rosh Yeshivas in Telz. So I have a personal connection to Telz because my Zayda, Olav Hashalom, learned in pre-war Europe Telz. And one of my regrets in life is that I didn't really speak to him about it more. He died when I was in yeshiva. And I wished, he didn't talk about it so much. We tried a little bit, but he didn't talk about his life before the war, but so much. But if I would have probed him more, maybe he would have said. But anyway, what Telz before the war was majestic. The Avos HaTorah in Telz was palpable. And Ramotel Katz was one of the Rosh Hashiva there. He survived the war. I think he was away from Telz when the war broke out, and he was together, I think, with Rabbi was away from the yeshiva collecting funds, and he was unable to travel back. And sadly, his wife and children, and indeed the whole community of Telz, were wiped out by the Nazis, I think, on one fateful day during the war. And Ramotel Katz, he found himself in America, bereft of his wife and family, with a product of the famous Telz Yeshiva, one of the great Rosh Hashiva there, coming to America and trying to rebuild. The challenge was enormous, and there are many stories about this. If I'm not mistaken, I once heard a story that Ramotel Katz was in his office, and although he was very much focused on rebuilding and not being weighed down by the past and moving forward, one time someone went past his office and saw him sort of shedding a tear, crying in his office. It was very uncharacteristic. And they went in and they said, Rosh Hashiva, is everything okay? And Ramotel Katz said, I was just thinking about my wife and children who perished in the war. And now, it was in the 1950s, it's 10 years on. He said, for a moment I just couldn't remember the names of all my children. He had 10 children, I think. Can you imagine the challenge ahead of him? The famous story of the Ramotel Katz, I think it was him, that he went to buy a k'tzois in the Lower East Side. And he asked the Moiches Sfarim if he can buy a k'tzois. And the Moiches Sfarim, he says, yes, I think I've got one left. He went up to some dusty shelf, climbed the ladder, he pulled it down and famously gave it to Ramotel Katz and says, here, this is the last k'tzois to be sold in America. And Ramotel Katz said, not true. He was there with a mission to rebuild Torah in America, to replant Telz from Europe into America. And he said to the Moiches Sfarim, you'll see, there'll be hundreds of k'tzois sold still in America. And in a way he was wrong, because it's not hundreds, it's thousands. And anyway, that's Ramotel Katz. But anyway, just to give you an idea of the man, but then this is the story that Rabbi Fran tells, and a remarkable story. In the 1950s in Telz, the boys came to him, the Bochrim, and they said, Rabbi, Rosh Hashiva, we would like to daven Maariv early tonight. Is that possible? A bit earlier than normal. Why is that? Because there's a big boxing match, and we want to watch the match. Can you imagine the contrast of pre-war Telz, the majesty and the caliber and the standard, and then coming to America, to a different world, 1950s, boys, young men who didn't appreciate the pre-war Europe that they had been destroyed, and he agreed to it. He said, okay, because he recognized that's where they were holding, and that's the point, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't prevent the tragic episode of the spies, because Klal Yisrael weren't on the spiritual level to hear the answer no. So that's one, the power of silence in chinuch and in parenting. Now, you see this concept of silence also in the Haftarah, because the Haftarah, of course, relates to the Sedra and deals from Yeshua Perek Aleph, the very first Perek of Nach. The Pasuk says, "Vayishlach Yeshua benu min hashmayim shnaim anoshim meraglim," two spies, cheresh leimor. L'churu es eretz v'siricha. What's pshat cheresh leimor? So there's a very interesting radak. The radak, and the question is, of course, why on earth did Yeshua send spies after the disastrous episode in this week's Sedra? Why on earth would he sort of go down that route again? It ended in calamity. So why would Yeshua even think to send spies after the disastrous episode in this week's Sedra? Says the Radak, the answer is Cheresh Leimor. Look at this. Look at the Radak in the box, in the next box. Cheresh Leimor, his hiram sheyelchu b'shtika. He told them they should go quietly. Holchim k'chareshim, cheresh is someone who's silent. Shelo yagishu behem. Rotzuleima b'seiser, to go secretly. Sholcham, he sent them. He sent them out quietly. They discreetly go on their mission because it would be it would boost morale, that they'd come back and say, yeah, we can do this, as he goes on to say. But the key is cheresh, and the point is that if you go discreetly and quietly, then the likelihood is that mission will succeed, because ein lecha davar yoseh tov min hatznius. Something which happens discreetly and quietly will succeed, will endure. And you see the same concept with the first and the second luchos, with the luchos Rishonos and Shnias. Take a look at the Medrash Tanchuma in the bottom box of the page. Haluchas Rishonos al shenosnu b'pumbi. The first luchas were given in tremendous fanfare. Lefichach shaltu b'mayin hara. It therefore attracted the ayin hara. V'nishtabru, and they were broken. V'kan omli HaKadosh Baruch Hu ein lecha yafim min hatznias. The pasuk says in Micha, Hashem derish mincha ki im oisem mishpat v'avas chesed v'asnei aleches. All HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants is those things. Oisem mishpat, avas chesed v'asnei aleches. My father's favorite pasuk. So in other words, the contrast, the reason why the second luchas endured and the first didn't, because the first the luchas rishonos were nosnu b'pumbi, were given in this big pomp and ceremony as a sound and light show. Mashenken, the luchas shnias were given more discreetly, and ein lecha yafim min hatznius, and that's why they endure. And therefore, Yeshua sending the spies, doing so discreetly and quietly, as described in the first parak in Yeshua in this week's Haftarah, Yeshua wasn't scared about it. Because if something is done modestly, discreetly, without fanfare, it's likely to succeed. He quotes from Elia Meir Bloch, another that tells Rosh Hashiva, that surely HaKadosh Baruch Hu knew this, and yet he gave it amidst kolos of rakim. So Elia Meir Bloch says something very interesting. In a perfect world, the Pasuk in Mishlei says, Chochmas bachutz toreina, that you scream out your song in public, b'rechayvus titen koila. However, sometimes our own personal interest gets mixed in, and we forfeit the great opportunity and must resort to an existence of tznius hidden from sight and attention. I remember, I've got it here, there was an article just the outset of COVID in March 2020 by Eitan Cobra. It was in, I think, the summer of 5780 of 2020. And he reflected back and said January and February was the season of the Siyum, where hundreds of thousands of Jews of all shades and stripes came together, linking arms to dance and sing in unison, and gave honor to the Torah and those who learnt it. And suddenly, in March 2020, there was this bleak, unending isolation. So a high level of sneers and private Kiddush Hashem sort of was forced upon the Jewish people, and the contrast of that, there's a message there. What exactly is the message? Every individual has to think about, to reflect on that message. That's something that Rabbi Plotnik of Chicago, he wrote in the Mishpacha the following week. But the point is that doing things discreetly and quietly, undertaken with modesty, are much more likely to endure. Ein lecha davar, ein lecha yafa min hatznius. Okay, that's the opening idea. The second idea is a beautiful piece from my friend in the Parsha Vart. Let's take a look. The end of the Parsha. Vayu b'nei Yisrael b'midbar. The end of the Sedra. The Bnei Yisrael were in the Midbar. Vayimtzu ish makoshesh eitzim b'yom haShabbos. And the famous story of the Makoshesh. He was gathering wood against the halacha on Shabbos. Vayanicho seba mishma. He was, if you like, held to account. He was put in the holding cell. Vayom Hashem al Moshe. Mos yumas ha'esh. The person is chayiv misa. Vayitzur so kol ha'edel mechus tamachana vayirgum Moshe ba'avonim vayamas. That is the end of the Makoshesh. The famous case where he is stoned to death for his chilul Shabbos. And then straight afterwards, Vayom Hashem al Moshe lemer dabel b'nei Yisrael v'amartu aleihem v'osu lohem tzitzis. It's a very strange juxtaposition at the end of this week's Sedra. The Makoshesh goes into the Parsha of tzitzis. What's the connection? There's a fascinating Yalkut Shimoni. Take a look at the second box in paragraph 2. Tonah Devei Eliyahu. The Yalkut Shimoni quotes the Tonah Devei Eliyahu. Vayamtziu ish Makoshesh eitzim. Amen HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe, Chilel zeh Shabbos. This person was Mechal Shabbos. So Amar Lefanov, so Moshe Rabbeinu defends him and says, Ribono shel olam, al tiyadeh b'chol yom tefillin b'roshei, tefillin b'zro. Each day, this person had the merit of wearing tefillin on his arm and tefillin on his head. V'royanos v'chorze b'o. He had a deterrent. He had something which would stop him from being mechalel. Achshav, from doing averas. Achshav she'ein lov tefillin. Now, today is Shabbos. So he didn't have that deterrent. You don't wear tefillin on Shabbos. So therefore, Chilel Zeh Shabbos. He didn't have the deterrent, and therefore he violated Shabbos. So Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu LeMoshe, okay, I hear you. Good argument. Tzei u'broi lohem davar she'yinagu bo b'Shabbos v'yom tovim. Find something which will be an alternative deterrent for them. And then it says, v'osu lohem tzitzis. Amazing. So you see the Yalkut Shimoni explains this very strange juxtaposition of the Makoshesh and the tzitzis. What was the juxtaposition? To tell us this very fascinating dialogue between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Moshe. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, this guy was Mechal Shabbos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe Rabbeinu said, yeah, but what do you want from him? During the week he had a deterrent. He wears tefillin, So on today, Shabbos, he's not wearing tefillin. What do you want? Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, good argument, and therefore find an alternative deterrent. The deterrent is tzitzis. Fine, beautiful. Interestingly, the Rechaim says that's why it says Vayoyma Hashem el Moshe, which begins the Parsha of tzitzis. Dabel b'nei Yisrael v'matzem tzitzis. This is Vayoyma Hashem. Says the Rechaim in the next box. Tam shinu Parsha zu shama Vayoyme ma she'en kein b'chol haTorah shebekulan hu Vayidaber. Normally the Parsha begins Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Leimer. Why here does it say Vayoyma Hashem el Moshe Leimer? Vayoyme is always a softer expression. Yispoil al pi ma'amaram, because he's quoting this Yalkut. Because you see from here, HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses the softer form of Vayomer instead of Vayidaber to reflect that HaKadosh Baruch Hu agrees to Moshe Rabbeinu's argument, and he gave Klal Yisrael a mitzvah that would protect them from further Chilul Shabbos. The difficulty is this: for the Makoshes to face a death penalty, to have been stoned to death, he had to be mazed, he had to be calculated, and he had to be given hasra. So how could wearing tefillin or even tzitzis help anyway? In order for him to have been killed, his chayav misa, he have to have been premeditated, a calculated decision to do the act of Chilul Shabbos. So how could wearing the tefillin be a deterrent, or tzitzis? Clearly the person was premeditated. So it was a calculated decision. How would that help anyway? The answer is, says Rabbi Friend, a beautiful pshat. Keeping mitzvahs, particularly tzitzis and tefillin, and all mitzvahs, they have a mystical power that somehow help on a spiritual or a metaphysical level. How? Unclear, don't know. But it works. And I see this in school sometimes. Sometimes there's a guy, tzitzis is part of school uniform in the boys' school. But how it impacts the person, it somehow rubs off. It somehow improves his conduct. And there's a famous Gemara in Menachos. You see this clearly in this Gemara. Take a look at the last box on the page. The Gemara Menachos Memdalad says the following: there was one individual who was very scrupulous about keeping tzitzis. And still, he was tempted by by doing a terrible aveira, and he heard there was a certain zayna in the Krach Hayam, in the faraway lands. She charged an exorbitant amount of 400 gold coins for her services. He sent the money to her, and he made an appointment to see her. And the Gemara tells the whole story that he went there, and as he was getting undressed, about to commit this aveira, the tzitzis that he was wearing, he took them off, and it sort of slapped him in the face. And suddenly that sort of was a sort of a bowl of cold water thrown over him. He suddenly had his realization: what am I doing? What on earth am I doing? He got off the bed and he sat on the ground, and she said to him, what flaw did you see in me? I've never seen a beautiful woman like you in the world. You're the most beautiful woman in the world. But what can I do? There is a mitzvah called tzitzis that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has commanded us to keep. And therefore, I can't proceed. I've got these 4 witnesses against me. I can't proceed with this aveira. Look what the continuation of this Gemara. Just before you go, you got to tell me your name, you got to tell me where you live, who your Rabbi is, which base of medrash do you learn it. He gave her all these details. She then decided, she liquidated all her assets. Shlish l'malchus, a third she gave to the government. V'shlish la'anim, a third to the poor. V'shlish not l'biyad, and a third she kept with her. Ubas the base of medrash Reb Chia, and she came to the base of medrash Reb Chia. Amalei Rebbe tziva alai v'yasuni gyeres. I want to convert. Maybe you're not doing it for altruistic purposes and it's not the Shema. And he was convinced that it was not the case, and it was actually 100% the Shema. Go and take your mekach, and she ended up marrying him. Remarkable Gemara. But what you see from this Gemara, you see that wearing tzitzis, and indeed all mitzvahs, can somehow give spiritual protection for an individual. How? Don't know. On some spiritual, metaphysical level, they have this mystical power that they can protect. And that really is the point. Yes, the Mekoshish was doing Chilul Shabbos, and for him to have been stoned to death, it must have been bemazed, and therefore you need to do it on purpose, calculated, with Eidim, with Hasra, etc., etc. But the point is that just wearing tzitzis could be a deterrent even from that, because that is the power of mitzvahs. So there we have it. Two ideas that we've seen today. The first idea is the power of silence. In this article I read, a digital detox can have certain benefits. But what we see is, why didn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu prevent the episode of the Meraglim? The answer is because HaKadosh Baruch Hu recognized that Klal Yisrael weren't on the spiritual level to hear. And sometimes good chinuch, good parenting, silence is the correct response. And we see it in Mottel Katz. The godless of pre-war tells, but yet when he was replanting, until it developed into sort of regain that lofty levels, the boxing match, he felt that the appropriate answer was to acquiesce because they weren't on that level yet. And then we see a third aspect of silence, that sometimes silent, discreet, modest way of operating undertakings, they're more likely to succeed. And that's why Yeshua was confident not to make the same mistake again, because he was doing it not in this sort of public ceremony, he was doing it very quietly, discreetly, and therefore he was confident that it was going to have success. And that's really the difference between the first luchos and the second luchos. And then we see the spiritual protection of mitzvahs, this strange juxtaposition of the Mekoshish with the tzitzis, as explained by the Yalkut Shimoni and the Arachaim, and therefore you see that even though that the Mekoshish acted b'mezid, nevertheless the power of mitzvahs, they have this mystical power that they can serve as a deterrent of against doing averas, because that is the spiritual mystical effect of mitzvahs.